The firelight flickered across rough-hewn beams, filling the smoky air with a faint glow. The smell of roasted meat and damp wool clung to the heavy rafters, and the low hum of conversation swelled beneath the clatter of mugs. This was the world of the medieval tavern, a world that existed on the edge of respectability, yet at the very heart of community life. Taverns were not just places to drink ale. They were the crossroads of villages and cities alike, the hidden chambers where lives, ambitions, and secrets intertwined. Picture a cold autumn evening in the year 1385. In a bustling English market town, a weary traveler named Thomas pushed open the oak door of the Silver Boar. He was a man in his mid-30s, with calloused hands from years of labor and eyes that carried both exhaustion and unspoken questions. Behind him, the night air carried the scent of rain-soaked earth. Inside, warmth welcomed him like an old friend. The innkeeper, a stout woman named Margaret, nodded from behind the counter. Her husband had been lost to war a decade earlier, and now she ran the tavern with a sharp eye and unyielding spirit. She poured ale with steady hands but missed nothing, not the secretive exchanges in shadowed corners, not the sudden silences that often spoke louder than words. Thomas set down a few coins, grateful for a hot drink. His journey had been long, and the road from London was filled with both mud and rumors. Rumors of unrest. Rumors of kings clashing with nobles. Rumors of peasants whispering about freedom they might never see. At a table near the hearth sat Robert, a blacksmith known for his broad shoulders and fiery temper. Beside him, young Eleanor, the daughter of a merchant, listened with wide eyes. Robert spoke of the coming winter, of prices rising, and of soldiers demanding more from townsfolk who already had little to give. The tavern was a stage, and everyone played their part. Some came to forget. Others came to remember. And a few came because the tavern was the only place where their voices could be heard without fear. Outside, the medieval world was rigidly structured, kings and queens ruled from castles, bishops and priests watched over souls, and lords demanded obedience from those who tilled the land. But inside the tavern, for a few fleeting hours, a farmer might argue with a noble, and a soldier might confess his fears to a stranger. It was in these rooms that stories traveled. News from distant battles carried by mercenaries. Songs of forgotten heroes sung by wandering minstrels. Letters passed in secret, tucked into sleeves or hidden beneath platters of bread. As the night deepened, Thomas found himself drawn into a quiet corner where a hooded man nursed his drink. The man's voice was low, but his words carried weight. He spoke of a rebellion brewing in the north, of villagers refusing to pay taxes, of men gathering in the woods under cover of darkness. Thomas listened, torn between weariness and unease. He had left London to escape the noise of politics, yet here, in this humble tavern, he found himself face to face with the very currents shaping the kingdom. Margaret kept refilling mugs, her eyes flickering to the corner as though she, too, sensed the gravity of the exchange. She had seen men like the hooded stranger before, men who carried dangerous ideas along with their cloaks and coins. But she said nothing. Taverns were places where silence often protected lives. At another table, an aging soldier named William leaned back, recounting his days under King Edward. His voice cracked as he described muddy fields littered with armor, the cries of men fading in the wind, and the hollow reward of survival. Eleanor, listening nearby, could barely imagine such horrors. To her, war was a tale told by others. To William, it was the reason his hands trembled as he lifted his cup. Taverns were memory keepers. They preserved the laughter of weddings, the grief of funerals, the gossip of merchants, and the despair of widows. Within their walls, history was not written in parchment but in whispers and scars. And yet, not all was solemn. A jester passed through the doorway, his patched clothes jingling with bells. He told crude jokes, made faces, and lifted spirits with a song that lightened even William's weary heart. For a moment, the tavern roared with laughter, proving that even in the harshest times, joy could survive. But the hooded man's words lingered in Thomas's mind. Rebellion. Taxes. Shadows gathering. As he lay on the straw pallet Margaret offered for a few extra coins, Thomas wondered whether taverns like the Silver Boar were more than meeting places. Perhaps they were the birthplace of movements. Perhaps, in the low firelight and shared confidences, the seeds of change were quietly sown. The night outside grew colder, and the rain began to fall. Inside, the tavern hummed with life, its walls bearing witness to secrets that no parchment would ever record. And yet, beneath the laughter, the arguments, and the clinking of mugs, something deeper stirred, a sense that the world beyond those wooden walls was shifting. That history itself was leaning forward, listening in. The story of what truly happened inside medieval taverns was not just about ale and bread. It was about humanity itself, fragile, restless, and forever in search of connection. The fire crackled, the mugs emptied, and the night pressed on. But for Thomas, and for all who crossed the tavern's threshold, this was only the beginning of something larger. The rain drummed steadily against the wooden shutters of the Silver Boar, turning the night into a chorus of tapping and sighing. Inside, the tavern had thinned of its noisier patrons. Only the most devoted drinkers remained, their conversations reduced to murmurs, their laughter softened by fatigue. The fire still burned, but the logs had collapsed into embers, sending sparks upward with every sigh of the wind. Thomas lay restless on his straw pallet in the corner chamber. Sleep evaded him, not because of the discomfort of the bedding, but because of the words of the hooded man. Rebellion. Taxes. Men gathering in secret. He turned those words over like a coin, unsure of their weight, yet unable to set them aside. Through the thin wooden wall, he could hear voices drifting up from the common room. Margaret, the innkeeper, was speaking in hushed tones with the hooded stranger. Her voice, though lowered, still carried that unmistakable firmness, the sound of a woman who had weathered storms far greater than spilled ale or rowdy guests. "You bring dangerous talk here," she said. "If the sheriff hears of it, I could lose more than this tavern." The stranger's reply was softer, though sharp enough to pierce Thomas's ears. "Danger has already come, mistress. The people suffer, and the crown grows fat. Whether you speak of it or not, the fire spreads." Margaret did not answer right away. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weary edge of someone who had already buried too much. "I have mouths to feed, and walls to keep standing. Don't bring me into your wars." Their voices faded, leaving Thomas staring at the beams above his head. He thought of the villages he had passed on his journey. He remembered children with hollow eyes, fields left untended because the men were pressed into service, and women kneeling in church pews, begging for bread as much as for salvation. Sleep finally claimed him, but his dreams were troubled. He saw soldiers riding through mud, their banners heavy with rain. He saw fire licking at thatched roofs, smoke curling into the sky. And through it all, the hooded man's voice whispered like a ghost, "The fire spreads." Morning came gray and damp. The town stirred slowly under a blanket of fog, and carts creaked over the cobblestones outside. In the tavern, Margaret moved briskly, preparing bread and cheese for early customers. Her daughter, a girl of 12 with hair the color of chestnuts, helped her mother set the tables. Life went on, as it always did, even when shadows loomed on the horizon. Thomas sat at a bench near the hearth, sipping watered ale. Robert the blacksmith entered soon after, his hands already blackened from the forge. He clapped Thomas on the shoulder with a familiarity born of tavern bonds. "You stayed the night, then. Welcome to Silverford, traveler. What brings you here?" Thomas hesitated. He could not speak of his unease, nor of the conversation he had overheard. Instead, he said simply, "Rest." The roads were a man down. Robert laughed, a deep sound that filled the room. "Aye, that they do. But rest is scarce when taxes rise and work never ends. Even iron groans under the weight of the lords." Eleanor, the merchant's daughter, appeared not long after, her cloak damp with mist. She carried a small basket of spices her father sold in the marketplace, their fragrance cutting through the smoky air of the tavern. Her eyes found Thomas quickly, curiosity flickering in their depths. "You came from London?" she asked. Thomas nodded. "I did. What news from the capital?" "They say the king has quarreled again with his council. That the commons in Parliament grow bold." Thomas offered a faint smile. The capital is always full of quarrels. But yes, the commons are restless. Some speak louder than before. Her eyes widened. Do you think it will change anything? For people like us? Thomas did not answer at once. Instead, he studied her, young, eager, still carrying the hope of someone not yet worn down by disappointment. Finally, he said, change is slow. But sometimes it begins in places like this. Margaret shot him a look from behind the counter, as though to warn him not to fill the girl's head with dangerous notions. Yet Eleanor's face lit with quiet determination, her thoughts already racing ahead. By midday, the tavern was crowded again. Merchants, soldiers, peasants, and travelers gathered under its roof. A group of French traders had arrived, their accents thick as they bargained over ale. William, the old soldier, watched them with narrowed eyes, memories of battle still etched into his mind. He muttered to Robert, I fought men like those across muddy fields. Strange to drink beside them now. Robert shrugged. Times change, old friend. Coins have longer memories than swords. Nearby, the hooded man sat again, quiet but observant. His presence unsettled Thomas, yet he found himself drawn to the man's aura of secrecy. Eventually, he crossed the room and sat across from him. You speak of rebellion, Thomas said softly. But rebellion leaves widows and orphans. Why risk it? The man lifted his hood just enough to reveal a scar along his jaw. His eyes were sharp, but not unkind. Because widows and orphans already exist. The Lords take, and the king demands more. How long can the people endure? At some point, a man chooses chains or fire. Thomas felt the weight of those words. He thought of Margaret, of her daughter, of Eleanor's bright eyes. Chains or fire? Was that truly the choice left to them? The man leaned closer. You've seen the suffering. I can tell. Will you turn away, or will you listen? Before Thomas could reply, the door swung open. A hush fell over the tavern as two men entered, clad in the colors of the sheriff. Their boots struck the floor with authority, their eyes scanning the room like hawks searching for prey. By order of the crown, one of them announced, all gatherings must remain lawful. Any talk of unrest will be punished. We hear whispers in this town. Whispers of rebellion. Take care with your tongues. Margaret's hands froze mid-motion, but she forced a calm smile. This is an honest house, sirs. Only food and drink are served here. The soldiers did not answer. They walked slowly among the tables, their presence heavy, their silence threatening. The hooded man lowered his gaze, his hand tightening around his mug. Thomas felt his pulse quicken, fear rising like bile. At Eleanor's table, one soldier paused, eyeing the girl with suspicion. What's in your basket? He demanded. Spices, she said, her voice trembling. She opened it to reveal cinnamon and pepper wrapped carefully in cloth. The soldier grunted, unimpressed, and moved on. When at last the men left, the tavern exhaled as one. Laughter returned, though thinner, more forced. The hooded man looked at Thomas once more. You see now? Even silence is no refuge. They watch. They always watch. That evening, Thomas walked with Robert and Eleanor to the edge of the market square. The fog still lingered, cloaking the town in gray. Merchants packed their stalls, and children darted between carts, chasing each other with wooden sticks. Yet beneath the ordinary bustle, tension hummed like a hidden string. Robert spoke in low tones. There's truth in what that stranger says. Folk in the north have risen before. And here, too, men whisper when they think no one listens. Eleanor clutched her cloak. Do you think it will come here? Robert shrugged. Hard to say. But I'll tell you this, when the common man grows hungry, no king's order will keep him quiet forever. Thomas said nothing. His mind was a storm, caught between duty to his own safety and the stirring sense that history itself was shifting under his feet. As they turned back toward the tavern, they passed the church. Its doors stood open, candlelight spilling into the square. Inside, the priest's voice carried in prayer. Yet even here, whispers lingered, confessions not of sin, but of anger. Anger at taxes. Anger at soldiers. Anger at a world that promised salvation yet delivered suffering. Thomas looked back once more at the silver boar, its windows glowing with firelight against the mist. It seemed so ordinary, so fragile. And yet, within those walls, he sensed that something far greater than ale and bread was brewing. The tavern was no longer just a shelter. It was becoming a crucible. The night deepened. New travelers would come. New words would be spoken. Secrets would be shared, and choices made. And Thomas knew, with a heaviness he could not shake, that he was no longer a mere passerby. He was part of the story now. The silver boar glowed like a beacon in the foggy night. Its walls, weathered by years of smoke and storms, seemed to hold more than laughter and drink. They held secrets, heavy and alive, pressing against the timber like the tide against a ship's hull. Thomas lingered by the doorway, staring at the amber light flickering through the window. He could hear the rise and fall of voices inside, Robert's booming laugh, Eleanor's gentle questions, Margaret's steady commands as she kept her tavern alive against the weight of the world. But beneath it all, he sensed something else. A current. A pull. The feeling that the air was thick with decisions waiting to be made. He stepped inside. The warmth enveloped him instantly, and the noise washed over him. Yet every glance seemed sharper tonight, every whisper more urgent. It was as if the arrival of the sheriff's men earlier had broken some unspoken barrier. No one said it outright, but Thomas could tell, the town knew it was standing on the edge of something. The hooded man was there again, seated in the corner. His scar caught the firelight, giving his face the look of a map carved by battles long past. His eyes found Thomas quickly, almost expectant. Thomas hesitated, then crossed the room. "You chose to return," the stranger said. His voice was low, steady. "That tells me you're not blind to what's coming." Thomas lowered himself onto the bench. "I didn't choose," he murmured. "The times chose for me." The man gave a faint smile. "Then you already understand." At the next table, William the old soldier was in one of his reflective moods. The tavern had quieted just enough for his voice to carry as he spoke to Robert and Eleanor. "I've seen kings rise and fall," he said, his hands trembling as they wrapped around his cup. "But I'll tell you this, no crown is heavier than one worn by fear. When a king fears his people, he lashes out. And when he lashes too hard, the people no longer bow." Eleanor leaned in, captivated. "Do you think it could happen here?" William's gaze drifted to the fire. "It always can. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Robert grunted. "Then let it come. I've bent my back enough for lords who care only for their tables and horses. Let them feel the hunger of the people for once." Margaret, passing by with a tray, cut him a sharp look. "Careful with your tongue, Robert. Words have weight. They draw ears, and ears bring trouble." But Robert didn't flinch. "And silence brings nothing, Margaret. We've been silent too long." Her lips pressed together. She said no more, but her daughter, standing nearby, clutched at her skirts, eyes wide with the awareness that her world was no longer safe in the hands of adults. Later, when the tavern thinned and the fire sank low, Thomas joined Eleanor by the hearth. She had set aside her cloak, her hair loosened by the long evening. She studied him curiously, her voice soft. "You've seen more than most here. You've walked the roads, passed through London. Tell me honestly, is there hope? For us? For people like me?" Her question stilled him. Hope? The word felt fragile, almost dangerous. He thought of the hooded man's talk of fire and rebellion, of William's warnings, of Margaret's silent fear. And he thought of the faces he had seen in villages, the gaunt mothers, the weary fathers, the children with eyes far too old. "There is always hope," Thomas said at last, his voice heavy. "But hope doesn't come freely. It's bought, with struggle, with courage, with sacrifice." Eleanor's expression didn't falter. If anything, her chin lifted slightly, as though she was storing his words somewhere deep inside, preparing to draw on them when the time came. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, but it was an uneasy one. The sheriff's men passed through town more often, their presence deliberate, their silence more threatening than their words. They lingered at market stalls, questioned merchants, even paused outside the church as though the prayers themselves might hide treason. The tavern became the heart of it all. By day, it was the place for bread, ale, and laughter. By night, it was where conversations curled like smoke, slipping between mugs and overworn tables. News came in with travelers, more villages refusing to pay taxes, a manor house burned in the north, whispers that a lord's soldiers had been ambushed in a forest. Every story sparked debate. Every rumor carried weight. Margaret tried to keep her tavern neutral, but neutrality was becoming impossible. Even she, steady and sharp as iron, could not stop her gaze from flickering toward the hooded man whenever he entered. He never declared himself openly, yet everyone sensed he carried more than stories. He carried purpose. One evening, when the fog lay thickest and the moon was only a pale blur, he gathered a small group in the back chamber. Thomas, Robert, William, and even Eleanor found themselves seated around a narrow table lit by a single candle. Margaret stood in the doorway, arms folded, her presence both reluctant and protective. The hooded man leaned forward. "You've all seen it. The hunger. The fear. The way the sheriff's men patrol as if we're already criminals. Tell me, how long will you wait before deciding enough is enough?" Robert slammed his fist on the table. "I've already decided. I'll not bend my back for another tax. Let them come take it from my forge if they dare." William's voice was quieter, but firm. "I've lived through wars. I know what they cost. But I also know what it means when a people lose their dignity. If this is the path, it will be walked with blood." Eleanor's eyes flickered in the firelight. She looked young still, but her voice was steady. "Then it must be walked. If not us, then who? If not now, then when?" Thomas felt the weight of their eyes turn toward him. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to be drawn so deep into the current. He swallowed, hearing the rain begin to fall against the shutters again, as though the world itself was leaning closer to listen. "I don't know if I'm a fighter," he admitted. "But I know this, silence will not save us. The sheriff's men will come whether we whisper or shout. So perhaps it's better we find our voices before they take even that away." The hooded man nodded, satisfied. "Then it begins here. Not with fire, not with blood, not yet. It begins with unity. With watching, listening, gathering strength. When the moment comes, you'll know. And when it does, you must choose." Margaret finally spoke, her voice cutting through the room. "If you bring ruin to this tavern, you bring ruin to me and mine. I won't see my daughter starve because men couldn't hold their tongues." The hooded man met her gaze without flinching. "No, mistress. You'll see your daughter starve if nothing is done. That is the truth no silence can escape." The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to clear. Margaret turned away, but the tremor in her hands betrayed that she knew he was right. The turning point came faster than any of them expected. A week later, soldiers rode into Silverford with orders to collect new levies. The market square became a stage for humiliation. Families were forced to hand over what little grain they had stored for winter. Merchants were fined for supposed violations. And those who resisted were struck down, their punishment public, their cries echoing against the church walls. Thomas stood at the edge of the square, Eleanor at his side. They watched as Robert tried to intervene when a farmer's cart was seized. The soldiers beat him to the ground before the crowd, their boots heavy on his back. Margaret rushed forward to drag him away, her daughter screaming at her side. The people watched in silence, fear locking their throats. But in that silence, something shifted. Shame burned hotter than fear. Rage smoldered beneath the surface. Later, when Robert lay bruised but breathing inside the Silver Boar, the tavern was packed to its rafters. No one drank. No one laughed. They listened. They waited. The hooded man rose slowly, his presence commanding without force. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the room like the tolling of a bell. Now you've seen it. Now you know what chains feel like. The question is no longer whether to act. The question is when. The tavern held its breath. Faces hardened. Eyes burned. Even Margaret, standing behind the counter, did not look away this time. She met the hooded man's gaze, and for the first time, she did not protest. Thomas felt his heart pound. The tide had shifted. The choice was no longer distant, no longer theoretical. It was here. In this room. In this moment. And he knew, whatever came next, there would be no turning back. The Silver Boar was no longer just a tavern. It was a chamber of decision, a place where silence had died and whispers had hardened into resolve. The fire burned lower that night, but the air was hot, thick with anticipation. No one spoke lightly anymore. Every word carried the weight of the future. Thomas sat near Robert's bed. The blacksmith's face was bruised and swollen from the soldier's boots, but his eyes glowed with an iron determination that no beating could break. His hands, once steady on the forge, trembled when he tried to lift a mug, yet he forced a smile. "They can crush a man's body," he rasped, "but they'll never crush his will." Eleanor hovered nearby, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She looked younger in that moment, fear shadowing her expression, but beneath it Thomas saw something harder growing. Resolve. The kind that comes when fear and anger mingle, when injustice is seen not just as a story but as a wound carved into one's own home. William, the old soldier, kept pacing, his steps uneven but steady. His voice was quiet, though each word was sharpened by memory. "They think fear will keep us in line. They've forgotten what happens when people have nothing left to lose." The hooded man remained in his corner, silent as ever, but his presence filled the room. He studied each of them as though weighing their souls. At last, he spoke. "This is where it begins. Not with armies or banners, but with a choice. Do we stand? Or do we bow?" Margaret wiped the counter with slow, deliberate strokes. Her jaw was set, her face drawn. She had said little since Robert was beaten in the square. But when she finally turned toward the group, her voice carried the strength of years spent surviving alone. "I've fed soldiers, priests, and beggars alike. I've watched men talk themselves into graves. But what happened today," her voice cracked, though only slightly, "that I cannot forget. They humiliated him. They humiliated all of us." Her daughter, standing just behind her, reached out and touched her sleeve. The girl's eyes, wide and unblinking, held both fear and defiance. Margaret pressed her hand over her daughter's, her decision made in that quiet gesture. She looked at the hooded man. "Tell us what must be done." The following days blurred together. Silverford was not the same. The market square still bustled, children still chased each other through the mist, and the church bells still rang. But beneath it all ran a current of anger. Eyes met with new intensity. Conversations that once ended in sighs now lingered in determination. The tavern became the meeting place. By daylight it served travelers as it always had, bread, ale, and laughter layered over fatigue. But when the shutters closed and the fire dimmed, the tables filled with hushed voices. Men spoke of hidden stores of grain. Women whispered of neighbors willing to carry messages. Even priests, cautious and cloaked in silence, let slip prayers for deliverance not from sin, but from tyranny. Thomas found himself drawn deeper into it. He had not come seeking rebellion, yet rebellion had found him. He carried messages between villages under the guise of a traveler, slipping folded notes into his satchel. He listened to stories of hunger and hope alike, his heart tightening each time he realized how many lives hung on what they were beginning to weave. Robert, despite his injuries, insisted on joining. His forge became more than a place of work, it became a sanctuary where iron was bent into more than tools. He whispered of plowshares reforged, of nails turned to something sharper. William trained the younger men in the square under the guise of games, their wooden staves clashing while laughter masked discipline. And Eleanor transformed. The merchant's daughter, once wide-eyed with questions, began speaking with her own authority. She rallied the women, organized supplies, and carried herself with a dignity that made even older men pause and listen. In her voice was the fire of the future, and in her eyes the certainty that her generation would not live bowed. Yet the shadow of the crown loomed larger with each passing week. The sheriff's men grew bolder. They searched homes under the pretense of law, confiscating what little could be found. They dragged a farmer into the square for refusing to pay his levy and whipped him until his back was raw. The cries rang through the town, echoing into every heart. That night, the tavern overflowed. No one wanted ale. They wanted answers. The hooded man stood at the center of the room. His cloak was damp with rain, his eyes burning. "You see it now," he said, his voice low but fierce. "They will not stop. They will not rest until every crumb is theirs, until every soul is broken. There's only one answer left to us. Resistance." The word landed heavy. Some shifted uneasily, others nodded. Margaret looked at her daughter, then at Thomas. She said nothing, but her silence spoke louder than words. She was done denying what was already upon them. Robert struggled to his feet, his voice hoarse but unbroken. "I've swung a hammer my whole life. I'll swing it against them too, if that's what it takes." William placed a hand on his shoulder. "You'll not swing alone." Eleanor rose next. "And you'll not stand without food, or shelter, or care. We'll keep you strong." The tavern roared with agreement, not the cheer of celebration, but the cry of awakening. Thomas could not sleep that night. He lay awake listening to the rain against the shutters, his heart racing. He thought of the words spoken, the resolve hardened, and the dangers that lay ahead. He thought of Margaret's daughter, too young to carry such fear, yet already living in its shadow. He thought of Eleanor, her voice firm, her eyes blazing, and he wondered how history would remember her if history even remembered at all. By dawn, the decision was no longer in question. Resistance had begun. It started small. Men refused to hand over grain. Women smuggled messages tucked beneath loaves of bread. Farmers hid livestock in the woods at night. Children carried pebbles and sticks to throw at soldiers when no one was looking. Every act was small, but together they formed something larger, defiance. The sheriff's men noticed. They grew harsher, beating those who resisted, taking double from those who yielded. But still the people did not bend. Each punishment only strengthened the resolve. Each wound deepened the anger. Thomas carried more messages now, moving between towns, memorizing routes through fields and forests. He learned to watch for riders, to slip into shadows, to trust the silence of the trees. Each step carried risk, but each step also carried purpose. For the first time in years, his life felt less like wandering and more like belonging. One evening, returning from a neighboring village, he entered the Silver Boar to find the tavern charged with urgency. Faces were tense, voices low. Robert sat upright despite his injuries, William stood rigid as stone, and Eleanor leaned over the table, her hands pressed firmly to the wood. The hooded man's words cut through the murmurs. They plan to seize the harvest next week. Everything. If we lose it, the winter will starve us. We must act. A hush fell. The harvest was survival. Without it, there would be no spring. Margaret stepped forward, her face pale but her voice firm. Then we protect it. Whatever it takes. Eleanor added quickly, we can hide some in the woods. Split it among families. Make it harder for them to take it all at once. Robert's voice growled from his chest. And when they come to take what remains, we meet them. Not with pleas, but with strength. William nodded slowly. We've trained enough to stand. Not as soldiers, but as men and women with something to defend. And that is worth more than gold. Thomas felt the room tilt. This was no longer whispers, no longer scattered defiance. This was a decision to face the sheriff's men head-on. The hooded man's eyes scanned the room, reading each face, weighing each heart. Finally, he spoke. Then it is agreed. We hold the harvest. We protect it. If they come for it, they will not find us cowering. They will find us ready. The room exhaled as one. Fear lingered, yes, but alongside it now stood something stronger. Unity. The days that followed were filled with preparation. Grain was hidden in barns, carried in sacks under moonlight, buried in barrels beneath earth damp with rain. Livestock was driven into forest clearings, watched over by boys no older than 12. The tavern became the headquarters of it all, its rooms stacked with supplies, its rafters heavy with secrets. Robert, though still bruised, returned to his forge. The sound of his hammer rang through Silverford, sharper, faster, more urgent than ever. William gathered young men each morning, teaching them to hold staffs and slings with steady hands. Eleanor organized the women, ensuring food was set aside and medicines prepared. Even Margaret, once the voice of caution, lent her strength, her tavern open, her eyes sharp, her silence no longer born of fear but of purpose. And Thomas. Thomas felt the weight of it all settling on his shoulders. He had not sought this path, yet here he was, carrying notes, moving supplies, watching the faces of people who now looked to him as much as to anyone else. He realized, with both fear and pride, that he had become part of the beating heart of resistance. On the eve of the harvest, the tavern was silent. No laughter, no music, only the crackle of the fire and the low murmur of voices. The hooded man stood at the center once more, his cloak casting long shadows across the floor. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice steady, "they will come. And tomorrow, they will learn we are no longer theirs to command." His words hung in the air, heavy as iron. Around him, faces tightened, jaws clenched. Fear lived in every heart, but alongside it burned something stronger, the kind of fire that cannot be extinguished by boots or whips. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the silence. He thought of the roads he had traveled, the hunger he had seen, the laughter he had lost. And he knew, without doubt, that tomorrow would change everything. The Silver Boar's walls seemed to hold their breath. Outside, the night deepened. The fog rolled thicker across the square, cloaking the town in shadow. And within the tavern, every soul waited, knowing that dawn would bring more than light. It would bring the test of everything they had chosen to believe in. The morning after the warning of the soldiers' arrival was gray and heavy, the sky choked with clouds that threatened rain. The tavern stood quieter than usual, though its walls seemed to breathe with the weight of unspoken fear. Margaret's hands moved steadily as she set loaves of bread upon the tables, but her eyes lingered on the door, waiting for it to burst open at any moment. Thomas sat near the hearth, the hooded stranger's words still gnawing at him. He had come to the Silver Boar seeking rest, but he had found instead a current that pulled him deeper into the heart of unrest. The murmurs of rebellion, the whisper of soldiers closing in, it was no longer something he could ignore. Robert, the blacksmith, stood by the window, his broad arms crossed. His jaw tightened as he stared toward the muddy street, where carts rolled by slowly and townsfolk walked with their heads lowered. Fear had settled over the town like a cold fog, but beneath it, there was also something else. A defiance, quiet, but growing. William, the aging soldier, nursed his cup with trembling hands. His memories of battle had scarred him too deeply, and yet, as he listened to Robert speak of resistance, he felt the stirrings of duty once more. Perhaps he was too old to fight, but not too old to guide. Eleanor, the merchant's daughter, moved quietly from table to table, whispering to those who gathered. Her voice was soft, but her words carried urgency. She reminded them that soldiers were men, just like them, and that their strength lay not only in weapons but in unity. Many were surprised at her boldness, yet they listened, for there was truth in her words. The hooded stranger had left before dawn, disappearing into the mist with no promise to return. But his presence lingered, like a shadow cast across the room. It was his words that had set all of this in motion. His warning had become their burden. By midday, the rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the roof and dripping through cracks in the beams. The tavern filled with people seeking shelter, farmers, craftsmen, wives with children clutched to their skirts. The Silver Boar, once a place of laughter and drink, now felt like the beating heart of the town itself. Thomas rose at last, his voice calm but steady. We cannot wait for them to come to us. We must meet them as one, not as scattered souls. If we stand together, perhaps they will think twice. And if they do not, he hesitated, his gaze sweeping across the faces watching him. Then at least history will know we did not bow in silence. A murmur rippled through the room. Some nodded. Others looked to the floor. Fear was still there, it would always be there, but now it mingled with something stronger. Robert slammed his fist onto the table. Then we fight, in whatever way we can. With hammers, with stones, with our bare hands if we must. Let them see that this town will not break so easily. William raised his trembling hand. A fight is not won by fury alone. You must be clever. Soldiers expect chaos. Give them unity instead. Use the streets, the alleys. Know the ground better than they do. That is how battles are turned. Margaret's voice cut through the clamor. And remember, the tavern has eyes and ears. Do not speak more than you must. Words can be as dangerous as blades. The rain continued to fall, blurring the view beyond the windows, as though the world itself were holding its breath. By evening, the sound of hooves on wet cobblestones echoed through the town. The first of the soldiers appeared, their armor dull beneath the rain, their banners heavy with damp. They came not as a conquering army, but as a warning force, a dozen men at most, yet more than enough to remind the town of its place. The tavern fell silent as the soldiers passed, their boots splashing through puddles. Through the cracks of the shutters, the townsfolk watched. A child whimpered. A mother hushed him quickly. The captain dismounted, his eyes scanning the street. He was a man hardened by years of command, his face weathered, his expression unreadable. He ordered his men to spread through the town, to collect what was owed. Taxes. Supplies. Obedience. But the people did not scatter. For the first time in years, they did not cower behind doors. They stood in the rain, their backs straight, their gazes unflinching. Margaret stepped forward from the tavern's threshold, her apron soaked, her chin lifted high. This town has given enough, she said, her voice steady though her hands trembled. We have buried fathers, sons, and brothers. We will not give more. The captain's brow furrowed. He had expected silence, submission. Instead, he found defiance in the eyes of a tavern keeper. Robert moved beside her, hammer in hand. Eleanor, too, stepped forward, her cloak clinging to her shoulders. One by one, others emerged from the tavern and nearby homes, until the narrow street was filled with townsfolk standing shoulder to shoulder in the rain. The soldiers shifted uneasily. They were trained for battle, but not for this, not for an unarmed crowd that refused to bend. The captain raised his hand, and his men hesitated. He could order them to strike, to cut down the defiant. But he saw in the faces before him something that gave him pause. These were not rebels with swords and banners. These were farmers, smiths, widows, children, yet their unity was a force stronger than steel. A long silence stretched, broken only by the rain. At last, the captain lowered his hand. Enough for today, he muttered. His men looked at him in confusion, but he did not explain. He mounted his horse, signaling the others to follow. The soldiers rode on, their presence lingering like a storm that had not yet passed. When they were gone, the crowd let out a collective breath. No cheers, no victory cries, only relief, fragile and fleeting. For they knew this was not the end. The soldiers would return. Perhaps in greater number. Perhaps with orders that left no room for mercy. But something had shifted. The tavern had become more than a place of food and drink. It had become the soul of the town, the hearth around which courage had been kindled. That night, the silver boar glowed with firelight once more. The people gathered not in fear, but in quiet determination. They spoke of what had passed, of what might come, and of how they would face it together. Thomas sat at the corner table, his heart heavy but resolute. He knew he could not return to the quiet life he had sought. He was part of this now, bound to these people by shared risk and hope. Perhaps history would forget their names, but it would not forget what they had stood for. William's voice carried over the hum. I have seen battles lost and won, but I tell you this, the greatest victory is not in killing, but in refusing to be broken. Today, you prove that. Eleanor looked around the room, her eyes shining. And tomorrow, we must prove it again. And again. Until the world listens. Margaret raised a mug, her voice ringing clear. To the Silver Boar, not just a tavern, but a place where we remember who we are. The mugs lifted, the fire crackled, and for a moment, warmth triumphed over fear. The medieval tavern was never merely a place of drink. It was the pulse of a community, the silent witness to grief, laughter, rebellion, and resilience. Within its walls, ordinary people found extraordinary courage. History was not only forged in castles and on battlefields, but in places like this, where strangers became allies, where silence gave way to voices, and where the seeds of change took root in the most unassuming of hearths. The Silver Boar's story did not end with that night, nor with those who first filled its benches and warmed their hands by its fire. Its walls would hold countless more secrets, its beams would echo with countless more voices. But for those who stood together in the rain, it was the beginning of something greater. For in the heart of a medieval tavern, humanity itself was laid bare, fragile yet unyielding, fearful yet brave, broken yet forever reaching toward freedom. And though the rain fell heavy outside, within the Silver Boar, hope burned brighter than ever.